the Universidad de los Andes in Bogotá, Colombia. Danielle's someone who, for those of us working on things like diversification and evolutionary assembly of communities and a variety of evolutionary processes in the neotropics, Danielle's name is very, very well known. He's published broadly on these topics, primarily in birds, but also other vertebrates, and his work is very well relevant to processes. Thank you. Processes more generally. Danielle did his undergrad at the Universidad de los Andes and then went on to do a PhD at University of Missouri St. Louis, where he was co-advised by Bob Rickliffs and Betty Loisel. And then from there, he went straight back. They hired him back at Los Andes, and he's been a professor there ever since. So I'm very grateful that he's come all the way from Colombia just to give the talk today. And also tomorrow, we're making him do 2 talks. So if you have a chance tomorrow at 2 p.m., Danielle will be giving another talk at the RMC that will be more focused on biodiversity surveys and some ongoing initiatives going on in Colombia that we're all excited to hear about. So please join me in welcoming Danielle.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Ben, for the introduction and for the invitation. Thanks, everybody, for coming. Yeah, the audio is weird. I guess you can hear me fine? Yeah, OK. It's an honor to be here, to come all the way from the tropics to the temperate zone to talk about tropical diversity. So I'll be sharing some work we've been doing on the diversification of birds in mountains, which I hope will be relevant for people interested in the origin of biodiversity more generally. So like I said, I come from the tropics, where it's a lot warmer than here. These maps of showing the diversity of vertebrates are well known to pretty much everybody, with diversity concentrated in tropical areas of the world. And in particular, where you, if you zoom in into the New World, you see diversity is clearly structured geographically, with higher diversity near the equator and in places like the foothills of the Andes or along the Amazon basin. But also, if you look at the specific components of biodiversity, say the distribution of narrow-ranged species, endemics, they also cluster in the tropics, particularly in mountain areas of the tropics. So diversity there is very high. And people have been interested in understanding the origins of diversity for a very long time. And I'm, of course, interested in understanding that diversity myself. Just to give you a sense of what I mean by mega diversity when I talk about birds, I like to do this exercise when I talk about my research to, say, non-biologists in Colombia, say my mom or people like that. And I challenge them to name a few birds. So Colombia is the first country in the world in terms of bird diversity, with more than 1,900 species of birds. And every Colombian is proud of that. And people know that fact. But when you challenge them and tell them to name species of Colombian birds, the layperson, the average layperson, will not be able to name, say, more than 10 birds. And what people say often when they try to embark on this challenge is they say, well, I can name a few birds. There's the pigeon, there's the parrot, there's the hummingbird. It's something I get pretty often. So it turns out that when you're in Colombia, the hummingbird might mean a lot of different things. So we have more than 130 species of hummingbirds in the country. And here's a sampler of photographs showing hummingbird diversity. All of these pictures were taken in Colombia, showing that we have a lot of diversity in terms of species, but also in terms of habitats, interactions with other species, ecologies, colors, behaviors, et cetera. Diversity is just astounding across the board. There's a lot of birds there, and there's a lot of cool things these birds are doing. And I'm interested in understanding the origins of that diversity. So none of those photos, by the way, were taken by me. They were by this guy, Murray Cooper, shown here. So of course, I'm interested in the question of why. Why is it that Colombia, or more precisely, northern South America, is a hotspot for biodiversity across not only birds, but many taxonomic groups? And what I'd like to talk to you about today is about sort of 2 ways in which we are approaching this. First, looking at diversification, and I'll talk about some old and new ideas about the origin of diversity. And also I've been very interested in sort of the ecology-evolution interface in trying to understand how species are able to coexist, say, in a given mountain where you might find turnover of species with elevation. I'll focus more on the evolutionary side, but I'll touch on this a little bit. So we've been doing, like, part of my work has focused on the phylogeography of birds, so doing things like going through a bunch of different places, collaborating with people, museums, et cetera, to get samples from throughout the ranges of species, like in this case. And we've typically done intraspecific phylogeographic studies where something that we find very often is patterns like this. Like within a single species, we're finding a bunch of different clades that are highly divergent from each other, and often those clades coincide very precisely with structures, with features of the landscape. Say a dry river valley separates divergent clades, the high ridge of a mountain separates clades on separate slopes, et cetera. So for one of the reasons why I think the Andes and the northern South America are so diverse is because there's a lot of opportunities for typical, allopatric speciation mediated by barriers. Another point that I think has been emerging with studies we've done recently is that not only do you get a lot of populations diverging from each other, but those populations persist over time. And persistence is a critical aspect of speciation. If things diverge but don't persist, you're not going to get the accumulation of species diversity. And this is just an example of a paper we recently published that shows that within a single species recognized by taxonomists, ranging from the highlands of Mexico down into Bolivia, we did a mitochondrial DNA study that showed that I don't know how many species are within this clade, but what I can say is that if you calibrate a phylogenetic tree to show time, you have a bunch of different lineages of relatively old age within a single species. So here, what you can see is that within the gray-breasted woodwren, there are 42 different lineages that are at least 1 million years of age, 25 lineages that are at least 2 million years of age, et cetera, et cetera. And this is within a single taxonomic species of bird. I'm not going to argue that we have 40-something or 20-something species here, but my point is that there are a lot of old populations within widespread species. So populations persist, and that is arguably an important component of high speciation. The other thing, of course, is that the landscape in South America is a structured landscape where you get a lot of opportunities for allopatric divergence. I showed you the example of Andean birds that show divergence across valleys, et cetera. We've also studied some lowland birds that have distributions, say, occurring on both sides of the Andes, like this sample shown here. So the Andes probably serves as a barrier separating lowland populations of birds on either side, and this is another mechanism that has led likely to high speciation in the region. And we did a paper a few years ago led by Brian Smith, then at LSU, looking at the phylogeography of 27 different lineages of lowland birds in South America across major barriers like the Andes, the Isthmus of Panama, and major rivers in Amazonia. And what we found is that although all these species are structured according to these barriers, so you have divergent lineages in the different, separated by different barriers, in general, what we see is that the ages of splitting events across those barriers vary a lot. So we don't see a signal of synchronous divergence across barriers, which is what you would expect if you have a signal of range-wide vicariance, where, say, the uplift of the Andes fragmented populations of a lot of different birds at the same time generating divergence. That's not what we see. We see histories where divergence across barriers is very recent, and histories where divergence across barriers is ancient. So we argued in that paper that probably what drives speciation in birds in the region is the existence of this structured landscape where you have the mountains and rivers, et cetera, and its dispersal across those barriers, which might occur at different moments in time, which leads to allopatric separation of populations, which initiates speciation. So speciation is driven more actively by organisms dispersing across barriers than by, say, passively being fragmented by vicariant events. Something I'm especially interested in is the fact that when you look at the tropics are, in many ways, hotspots of diversity at the alpha level, at the local level, but specifically when you look at beta diversity, the changes in species composition in space, additional patterns emerge. So tropical mountains are hotspots of beta diversity worldwide. And that is because when you move geographic distances in mountain areas like the Andes, you get replacement of species with elevation. So turnover along elevational gradients is very high in tropical mountains, and that is arguably one of the causes of the high diversity we see in this region. So this high species turnover in Andean mountains leads to patterns like the Andes being a hotspot of both old and young species, as evidenced by this figure here. So I'm particularly interested in understanding how is it that species originate in mountains and how do they accumulate over time. And this is data I pulled out from a monograph on neotropical birds where I plotted for all species in 3 large families of birds, their elevational ranges from lowest to highest. And what you can see is that very few of these lines encompass a wide range, showing that species have restricted elevational ranges, and there's almost complete turnover in assemblages from, say, foothill forests up to the higher alpine areas in the Andes. And actually, if you take and calculate the median range size in terms of meters and plot it on these figures, it's remarkably consistent across families. The typical species of bird only encompasses about 1,000 meters elevation in the Andes. And you have gradients there that might be, I don't know, 3,000, 4,000 meters along mountain slopes. So I would argue that in order to understand why are mountains so diverse, an interesting question to ask is what sets the range limits on elevational gradients? How is it that you can pack a bunch of species replacing each other with elevation? And this occurs not only across birds. A lot of tropical organisms have restricted elevational ranges. So here's an example from one of my former PhD students, Paulo Pulgarin. He studied blood parasites affecting birds in different areas of the world. So this is a mountain region in New Guinea. This is elevation, and these are different lineages of parasites found in birds along this elevational gradient. And you can see that the parasites also have restricted ranges, more so even than birds, with only a median of about 600 meters elevation. So how do those elevational replacements arise? How is it that you end up with species A and B replacing each other along an elevational gradient? So there's a classic evolution paper by Jim Patton and Smith published in 1992 who proposed essentially 2 potential explanations. One is the so-called gradient model, where replacement of related species across an elevational gradient reflects parapatric speciation, where you had an ancestor widely distributed in the mountain which diverged into 2 separate species, one lowland, one highland, likely due to selection. And then sister species, then species in a different mountain are also going to be sister to each other. Whereas under a vicariant model, what you have is that populations occurring at the same elevations in different mountains are going to be more closely related than what they are to their counterparts being replaced at lower or higher elevations. So they tested for these 2 alternatives in mice of the genus Acheron based on data from Peru, and they found overwhelming evidence for the vicariant model, where you don't find phylogenetic evidence of sister species occurring on the same transect. And they suggested that speciation is largely allopatric, with elevational replacements reflecting secondary contact of populations. So this had not been tested very much in birds, and we've been doing our work on this for several years now. And one of the places we've been fortunate to work in is the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta in northern Colombia. So this is an isolated mountain nearby the ocean. So our field sites are horrible. You basically, when you wake up in the morning and look down on the mountain, you can see the ocean here. This is the town of Ciénaga, nearby Santa Marta. There's dry forest here. And then you get foothill forest turning into lower montane forest. And if you look on the window of the house we stay in, looking to the other side, this is what you see. You see the high elevation forest with wax palms, clouds that come and go every afternoon. And if you're lucky, you see the snow peaks. So these are actually the highest mountains in Colombia, more than 5,400 meters elevation. And there are some bird species that range widely along these elevational gradients. This is an isolated mountain that has not been connected to other mountains in the past. So this seemed to be like a prime scenario for the potential to have species diverging along an elevational gradient. It's isolated, it's hot and dry in the lower areas, and it's humid and cool in the higher areas. And it turns out that there are birds there which might be good candidates for parapatric ecological speciation. So we did a study a few years ago looking at gray-breasted woodwrens in the area, and we found that if you do an elevational transect, you can find that there are two distinct groups that are recognizable based on nuclear DNA, microsatellites or sequences of a nuclear intron, mitochondrial DNA, morphometrics, and even their songs, and we did behavioral experiments, and we found that essentially there are two different things here replacing each other with elevation that differ morphologically, vocally, ecologically, and they diverge behaviorally as well. And basically what we found also is that there's a limited range of elevations at about 2,200 meters where these two things are sympatric. They co-occur, they have adjacent territories, and when you have sympatry with no evidence of hybridization, I'm very confident in calling these two things different species. So we think these are two distinct species that occur in the Sierra Nevada. The question then would be whether these two species are sister to each other, which is a prediction of the hypothesis that they diverge from primary divergence across the gradient. So to address that, we sampled widely from Mexico all the way down to Bolivia, covering the full range of the complex. And we did a mitochondrial DNA survey to see how closely related these species were. And we found that there's extreme population genetic structure in the complex from Mexico down to Bolivia. But actually, this was pretty useful because we were able to test whether these two things were closely related to each other or not. So to answer the question of whether there is phylogeographic evidence for parapatric speciation, meaning that these two things that differ from each other and occur in the same mountain are sister species or not, the answer is very clearly no, they're not. So these two things that replace each other in the Sierra Nevada Santa Marta are distantly related to each other, implying that this isolated mountain was colonized by these birds that I should say have very tiny wings and are terrible dispersers, at least twice independently. So we don't have evidence of parapatric speciation. This is actually evidence of secondary contact. Things that diverge in allopatry came together in this mountain slope. And something we found with this study that I thought was really cool is that we found that there are other areas in South America where you have elevational replacements of lineages of this same complex, which people typically call a single species. For example, in Western Ecuador, there are two lineages that replace each other with elevation. They're distantly related to each other. In Western Colombia, here, we have three lineages replacing each other with elevation, and they are in three different parts of the tree. And even in the Venezuelan Andes, we found a cryptic case of elevational replacement of lineages, which may or may not be sister to each other. I tend to think they're not. So two things here. It appears that things replacing each other with elevation are typically not each other's closest relatives, implying secondary contact, explaining elevational replacements. And then the other point I want to make, and I'm going to get back to this, is note all the cryptic genetic diversity within a single species that even involves divergent mitochondrial DNA groups coming together into secondary sympatry along elevational gradients. So this is all within a single, say species. I'm going to scale up to look at the same question at a more macro evolutionary scale, looking at a closely knit group, which are the Cytalopus tapaculus, which are birds which occur widely in mountains of the neotropics and are extremely poor dispersers. They don't have a wishbone, so their clavicles are not fused. They have tiny wings. They don't like to be out in the open, and they prefer to run more than to fly. So I think of them more as mice than as birds. And actually, they kind of look mice-like. Those birds shown there are 8 different species, which occur in the Ecuadorian Andes. And for those of you who are not ornithologists in the room, I'll tell you, ornithologists have a very hard time telling these things apart. Until recently, people only recognize about 12 species in the genus based on work we've been doing over the years and other people, we're up to more than 40 species recognized now because they differ genetically, vocally, ecologically, and this wasn't obvious until recently. These birds reach their highest diversity in the northern Andes, where you have the green is the distribution of Psittolopus, blue is the distribution of other species in the family, and bright green means a lot of species. So you can see that the highest diversity is in the northern Andes of Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru, where you find patterns like this shown here, where you find regions, like this is the eastern slope of the Andes of Peru, where Ben has worked some, where you have up to 6 species replacing each other with elevation. So this seemed like a good system to ask questions about how the diversity accumulate in mountains. So this is a project I started when I was a grad student years ago. I started collecting mitochondrial DNA data. And this is perhaps advice for grad students. Get your stuff out before the paradigm changes. So I got mitochondrial DNA data for a lot of birds, very hard to get, and then people started saying, well, you cannot publish that based only on mtDNA. But still, I think mitochondrial DNA gives you a lot of information. We built a phylogeny using mitochondrial DNA data for these birds. But a few years ago, I said, well, yeah, you need to look at nuclear loci as well. So we did a sequence target approach to reconstruct the phylogeny of this group, generated a lot of data. And for the purposes of what I'm going to say now, the trees we got are exactly identical to the mitochondrial DNA tree I've had for years and years now. Anyway, I'm hoping it's going to be more robust anyway. So what did we find? The first thing, birds in this genus have restricted elevational ranges. The mean is 1,000 meters, exactly the same for the other families I was showing. So elevational ranges are narrow. When you look at those elevational ranges in the context of the phylogeny, they tend to be evolutionarily conserved. So what we did here was we mapped the midpoint of the elevational range of species. You could do the minimum, the maximum. The answer is the same. You have some clades that occur in more lowland regions, some in more highland regions, some at mid elevations like those shown here, and there's high phylogenetic signal for elevational distributions, meaning that closely related taxa tend to have similar elevational ranges. The other thing we did was take sister species in this group and ask how much do their elevational ranges overlap. The hypotheses of parapatric divergence predict they should overlap very little if you have parapatric speciation along gradients, whereas the vicariant model predicts that sister species should overlap in their elevational ranges. We found overwhelming support for the latter. So if you plot elevational overlap against the number of sister species in the tree, most have very high overlap in their elevational ranges. We examined the sensitivity of results to to uncertainty in the reconstruction of the phylogeny, and typically sister species overlap a lot. And we did find a few sister species which do not overlap in their elevational ranges, but without exception, those sister species do not occur on the same mountain. So they might have different elevational ranges, but they're allopatric. So in these birds, I think it's very clear that sister species have the same elevational distributions typically. And then the other thing we did was go to different places and look at the elevational ranges of birds occurring in different gradients. So this is the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta in northern Colombia, the western slope of the Andes of Colombia, the eastern slope of the Andes of Ecuador, and the eastern slope of the Andes of Peru. And what you can see here, if we take the 3 first cases, is that species replacing each other in each of these gradients are widely scattered in the tree. So we find no cases where replacement involved close relatives. With the only exception being, which is quite intriguing, I think, what happens here in the eastern slope of the Andes of Peru, where a bunch of species that replace each other along that gradient do appear to be closely related. We're not sure if they're sister, but at least they are in the same clade. So I'm blowing up that here to show it in more detail. So 5 of the 6 species occurring in this gradient occur in this clade, and 4 of them, or 3, occur in this little clade here. And it turns out that if you do a BAM analysis to look at shifts in diversification rates over time, this particular clade here is the only clade which seems to have experienced an upturn in the rates of diversification through time. So this might reflect, I'm not sure, rapid ecological speciation associated with elevation. You need to test it further, but at least there's the potential that this, I'm not saying it never happens, it might happen in that group, but you need to test it. But in general, I think all the evidence of the work we've done, and we did this study a few years ago with a bunch of different groups of vertebrates, where we looked at the overlap in thermal niches of sister species occurring in mountains, we found that consistently in the tropics, particularly so compared to temperate zones, sister species have to have very high overlap in their thermal niches, meaning that they probably occur over the same elevational ranges. So I think it's fair to conclude that most tropical mountain vertebrate speciate within thermal zones, meaning at the same elevations in different mountains and not within a mountain slope across elevations. So this pattern of elevational replacement of species most likely represents secondary contact. So how do those elevational replacements arise? And this has intrigued people since Humboldt when he drew his famous profile of the Chimborazo in Ecuador, showing the turnover of species with elevation. And what are the implications of this for tropical diversity? So I think what happens is that first, lineages diverge in allopatry for the reasons I showed in association with barriers, and this leads to initial divergence. Then those lineages shift their ranges, and range expansions lead to secondary symmetry. I think an important component of all this is extinction. So things diverge in allopatry, come together, and oftentimes populations in the middle of the ranges become extinct, and then you repeat this cycle over and over, and this is what leads to the accumulation of diversity. I didn't mention extinction so far, so here I want to mention why I think this is important. So back to our gray-breasted woodwren example, what I'm showing here is these numbers are species identified by a coalescent method, basically showing units. I'm not going to call them species, let's say lineages that are sufficiently different from each other that this analysis picks them up as distinct. So we have 15 different lineages, coalescent species, within Colombia only, right? And what you can see here is that those lineages come from very different areas of the tree. You have cases like say this here, populations from Bolivia are not closely related to things from Peru or even Ecuador, but their closest relatives appear to be in the northern Andes. We have cases of populations like the Colombian endemic Encorrina negreti from southwestern Colombia, which appears to be more closely related to populations from Central America. And I don't think these birds are flying around. So these things didn't disperse from Bolivia to Colombia or from Colombia to Guatemala. What that probably reflects is the dynamics of extinction. So things diverge in allopatry, expand their ranges, come together, and things become extinct. And then those vacant spaces are left, those vacant spaces are filled by things that expand in another cycle of this that probably goes on and on and on. And that's how you lead to accumulation of diversity in mountains. Okay, so thus far I've sort of talked about the typical ways in which people think species form. You know, you have the allopatric differentiation, be it by vicariance or dispersal, or you might have parapatric speciation across mountains. There's the potential for some sympatric speciation in birds, but I think that's fairly rare. But what I want to do now is switch gears and talk about other potential modes of divergence that lead to high diversity in the tropics. And first I want to talk about the role that divergence in the timing of when organisms breed might lead to speciation. And it's well known that a bunch of different animals, like say salmon, cicadas, or crickets, might show species that differ in the moment of the year when they breed. So this allochronic isolation, with populations breeding in different moments, might have the potential to lead to the origins of new species, meaning that timing of breeding can be a mechanism of reproductive isolation. In birds, thus far, people have not considered this to be very important, but I would argue that there are reasons why you might think this could be important. For one, reproduction in birds is highly seasonal, and it's tied to changes in the environment. So this is work done in Panama, in a tropical field site. What the figure shows is the volume of testes or follicles, so essentially gonad size in males and females across the year, and you can see these cycles in the growth and recession of gonads across the year. And that coincides fairly well with seasonality and climate. So birds are not breeding during the dry season, and they prepare for breeding at their gonads start growing at the end of the dry season, such that when they initiate nesting, and that's the triangle shown here, it's the beginning of the rainy season. The beginning of the rainy season is when a lot of plants flush leaves, there's a lot of insects around, so it's a good moment to have babies because there's a lot of protein in the environment. And this is highly repeatable year after year. So essentially, bird cycles in the tropics rely to a large extent on seasonality and rainfall because presumably this influences food availability. And of course, precipitation is highly seasonal and it's highly asynchronous in space. So to illustrate this point, pick your favorite point in that map. I'm going to suggest pick somewhere around here. And take a look at the colors. So purple means it's raining a lot, and red means it's raining very little. This is the month of January. So in January, it's very humid south of the equator in say, the Amazon, and it's dry up north. So it's super dry here, and it's humid here. And I'm going to circle through a full year, and so pay attention to what happens near the equator in terms of the precipitation patterns. So that's January, February, March, April, May, June, July. So by July, the pattern has been totally inverted. Now it's raining in the north, and it's super dry in the south, and we can circle through that to complete the full cycle. Okay? So the first premise is that avian reproduction is seasonal, and it's linked to rainfall. And there are seasonal patterns in precipitation that vary in space. So if you put those two things together, it means that birds in different places will likely breed at different times. And we have good evidence of that. Here's a nice study done by Ignacio Moore and colleagues in Ecuador. So these are two populations of the rufous-colored sparrow nearby Quito in Ecuador that are only 25 kilometers apart. What you can see here is that precipitation regimes between these two populations differ. When it's raining a lot in one of the areas, it's dry in the other, and vice versa. And when you look at the testosterone levels in birds across the year, you can see that the patterns are inverted. So here in February, in one of the localities, birds have a lot of testosterone circulating, and in the other side, it's low. And then during the humid season here, the pattern is inverted. Testosterone is high in this locality, low in this locality, meaning that they're breeding at different times. And I emphasize, these sites are 25 kilometers separate from each other. Basically, one is on one side of a mountain, and the other one is in the other side. So we do have evidence of this. So I had been wondering for years, actually, whether this might lead to divergence of populations. If climatic patterns are sufficiently stable that this can lead to long-term isolation, this might lead to the origin of species that diverge due to allochrony, changes in their breeding schedule associated with rainfall. And I always thought, well, this is really hard to test. Yeah, it'd be nice to test it, but nobody's going to do it. And then one day I see this paper in a journal that I haven't seen much of, but I didn't know you could publish an idea. So there's a journal called Ideas in Ecology and Evolution. And Paul Martin published this very nice paper. He thought about this a lot harder than I did. And he proposed the idea of what he called the asynchrony of seasons hypothesis. And basically what he suggested is that when you have asynchrony of seasons in terms of precipitation, when different sites are decoupled in terms of their rainfall regimes, that's going to lead to populations being asynchronous in their phenology in space. And this is going to limit gene flow, and eventually it's going to lead to population divergence. So basically what he argued was that if you have two different sites in a region, and you can quantify the asynchrony in rainfall between those sites, and then you measure somehow the genetic distance between populations, you would expect a positive correlation. So sites that are more asynchronous in rainfall should show populations that are more genetically divergent if this asynchrony is leading to population isolation. So I read that and I said, well, yeah, interesting, but who's going to test that? It's going to be real hard. Good thing is a great undergraduate student at Los Andes, Ignacio Quintero, who just finished his PhD at Yale, came up with the idea that he wanted to do this for his undergrad. And he came up with this figure, and he basically proposed a way that you could test this. So if you have a site where rainfall essentially shows this pattern here, and then the breeding seasons of birds are going to look like this, shown in green. And you compare that with a site that has this precipitation regime, hence this breeding seasons, asynchrony is quite high. You might have cases where asynchrony is complete, 100% asynchrony, like these two cases here. But when you compare this site and this site, asynchrony is much lower, only 15%. So you would expect low gene flow when there's high asynchrony, high gene flow when there's high synchrony. So we tried to test this using phylogeographic data for neotropical birds. So basically the process, I'm going to walk you through this real quick, was to collect locality data and phylogeographic data for as many birds as possible across the neotropics. Then we took all localities and quantified the asynchrony in rainfall. So basically, complete asynchrony was when between sites that when at a given moment in time, one site had its highest precipitation and the other site had its lowest precipitation. So that was our measure of asynchrony. I can talk to you about the details if you're interested. We used cloud cover data to quantify asynchrony that give you a very detailed picture of when it's raining in a given site and when it's not. So we had these matrices where we had precipitation as asynchrony, and we also had genetic distances between populations. So the idea would be to relate asynchrony and precipitation with genetic distance, and we hope to find this positive relationship that the hypothesis predicts. But of course, I've been talking about barriers for a long time. We needed to account for barriers, so what we did was build ecological niche models for species to quantify the ecological resistance to dispersal between different sites or to measure ecological connectivity. So we had a resistance distance that we corrected for to isolate the effect of physical barriers. We wanted to see whether precipitation asynchrony in fact leads to genetic divergence. And we did this for, or Ignacio did this for 56 different species of neotropical birds. And I'm going to show you the data for all species combined. So each dot here is a species, and what I'm showing you here is the Mantel coefficient relating these two matrices, the asynchrony in rainfall with the genetic distances. And you can see there's a lot of scatter, but in general, we found that there are a lot of species that show the positive association that the hypothesis predicts. More asynchrony, greater genetic divergence, more asynchrony in rainfall. And we actually did a phylogenetic meta-analysis to estimate a cross-species value for this coefficient, and it turns out to be significantly positive. So there is an association such that populations occurring in sites that are more different in rainfall regimes are more different genetically once you correct for the effect of geographic barriers. So that appeared consistent with the idea that this asynchrony of seasons hypothesis might be plausible. Some of you are probably wondering, well, where's the link with breeding seasonality? I started assuming that this relates to the time when birds breed. But I didn't show you that. I show you there's a relationship between asynchrony in climate and genetic divergence. The link with breeding seasonality is not there. And I'm not going to show it because it's tenuous. But I'll talk about this tomorrow a little bit. And we're trying to use specimens to try to characterize the breeding seasons of birds to see whether we can get at this more directly using data on breeding condition of specimens across the ranges. Okay, so I've shown you evidence that birds diverge in the Andes through the typical means, allopathic divergence. I just showed some evidence that might be consistent with the idea of allochronic divergence. And now I'm going to close by showing evidence of another potential mode of evolutionary divergence, which involves changes in behavior, and which, again, requires no changes in the physical landscape to promote divergence. Under this view that I just showed you, based on contemporary patterns of precipitation, you would expect populations to diverge. You don't need to invoke glacial cycles or the buildup of mountains, et cetera, to generate diversity. With the standing conditions, you might gain evolutionary divergence. So here's another case where even in the absence of changes, you might get evolutionary divergence. And in particular, I want to talk about the role that changes in migratory behavior in birds might play in the origin of new species. And to start with, I'd like to talk about the role of changes in migratory behavior in microevolution. based on work we've been doing with my former student, Valentina Gomez, on the fork-tailed flycatcher in South America. So this bird ranges widely in the neotropics, and it's an austral migrant in parts of its range. So there are populations that breed in southern South America and are migratory. They spend the winter in northern South America. And if you pay attention to this animation coming from the EEB data at the Cornell lab, there are times of year when these populations are sympatric. Say during June, all birds are here in the northern South America, and then when the summertime comes, they're going to migrate and breed here in Argentina, and then come back here again. So essentially, this is a bird that is a partial migrant, because some populations are resident. They stay here in northern South America year-round, and some populations are seasonal austral migrants that come and go. So these two populations are seasonally sympatric in parts of Colombia and Venezuela. So we sampled birds from across their geographic ranges, and the first question we wanted to ask was whether you could tell apart birds genetically, whether you could distinguish resident and migratory birds. So we used genotyping by sequencing to gauge variation across the genome. And if you do a typical clustering analysis, you find that the most likely number of clusters in the data set is 2. But even if you don't buy these clustering methods, what you can see is that, well, migratory and sedentary populations are different genetically. You can tell them apart quite clearly with these multi-locus data sets. So they are genetically distinct, suggesting they likely exchange few migrants. The other thing we did was to build a phylogenetic tree based on the GBS SNP data to see whether we could get any evidence of the direction of evolution in this system. And in particular, I was interested in whether you might be getting diversification via loss of migration. And I think that's probably what's going on, because what we find is that, look at all these deep branches in this tree correspond to migratory lineages. Note, this is not a clade here. This is a grade at the base of the tree. And actually, all sedentary populations are derived and nested within the migratory group. So it appears that sedentary birds are derived from migratory populations. If you take a population genetic perspective and look at things like heterozygosity or Tajima's D as a measure of potential changes in population size, resident populations shown here are much less heterozygous than migratory populations, which have a lot more heterozygosity. And Tajima's D shows evidence of reductions in population size in the residents, but not in the migrants. So what we think happened here is that the tropical resident population was founded from formerly migratory lineages that stayed in the tropics, and that probably entailed a founder event that led to loss of genetic diversity. We've done some field work to look at what these birds are doing in the field. Over 2 field seasons, we found, my students found 33 nests. All of them corresponded to the resident subspecies, so no nests of the migratory one. They're not breeding in Colombia as far as we can tell. We obtained data on a breeding condition from birds captured in mist nets. So these are breeding and non-breeding birds. Blue are the migratory ones. Yellow are the residents. So in June, July, most of the resident birds are breeding. A few are not, and these are largely juveniles. And none of the migratory ones are breeding. Actually, the migratory ones are flocking, and you would catch these big flocks that are moving around looking for fruit and things like that. They occur in the very same areas, but resident birds are territorial. They live in pairs, and migratory birds live in flocks and are moving around, and they're not interested in mating, apparently, whatsoever. So I think when you look at all the evidence together, I'm pretty convinced that these things are different species. They breed at different times in different places, because some of them breed in Colombia, others breed in Argentina, but they have the potential to interbreed because they are sympatric during part of the breeding seasons of one of them. Actually, so their seasonal cycles are totally decoupled. We did analyses looking explicitly at gene flow, and we found no evidence of gene flow from the migratory lineages into the sedentary lineages or vice versa. Actually, if anything, there's evidence of gene flow with the outgroup, which was kind of surprising. These things are also different morphologically. They differ in the shape of their primary wings and in sort of general anatomy. Migratory birds have longer, pointier wings and shorter tails than resident birds, and that's consistent with aerodynamic predictions. If you're going to migrate very far, long and pointed wings are advantageous, and you probably don't need or don't want a very long tail, which is going to be costly. So I think I'm confident in treating these two things as different species. We might disagree about species concepts, but we can discuss that. So I think here, actually, what we have is a case of speciation via loss of migration. Probably due to a change in behavior, a few individuals stayed and became resident, and that led to allochronic and allopathic divergence, which eventually likely led to speciation. And I think it's a case where speciation might be initiated by plasticity, a change in behavior, and once that change occurs, populations enter what you might call new adaptive zones, in which selection might take over and lead to adaptive divergence that might complete the process of speciation. I doubt that these birds are born with a mutation that tells them, hey, don't migrate anymore, just stay put. It's probably flexibility in behavior that initiates the whole process. And finally, I wanted to show you some data that Valentina has been collecting to look at what might be the macroevolutionary consequences of this kind of pattern. I showed it occurs within a given lineage. Does it occur more broadly across the flycatcher phylogeny? So she built a phylogenetic tree for the whole Tyrannidae family to which these birds belong, and she mapped the occurrence of different character states, being sedentary, being migratory, and being partially migratory, which is the case where you have species that have both resident and migratory populations. And Valentina tested a bunch of different evolutionary models to look at the evolution of migration in this group. And when you look at different models for the evolutionary transitions between being migratory, sedentary, and partially migratory, the model receiving the highest support consistently is this model shown here, where being partially migratory appears to be an intermediate step between being sedentary and fully migratory. But contrary to what many people think in terms of the evolution of migration, where people suggested that sedentary lineages become partially migratory and then become fully migratory, it seems that the most likely thing occurring in flycatchers is the other way around. So migratory groups lose migration, becoming sedentary, and they do so through partial migration. So losses of migration were a lot more common than gains of migration in the tree. So this pattern we're seeing in the fork-tailed flycatcher has occurred at a macroevolutionary scale. And the question you might ask is, well, if this has repeated itself, has it led to the origin of new species? And one of the ways you could look at that is to estimate the rates of diversification of groups with the different migration strategies. And what Valentina found, looking at this across a bunch of different phylogenetic trees and estimated speciation rates, is that in fact, the speciation rates estimated for migrants, be they partial migrants or fully migratory lineages, far exceeds that of resident birds. So migratory groups in which you might have this potential to speciate via changes in migratory behavior have higher rates of diversification than sedentary groups. So I'm not saying that all speciation in flycatchers was mediated by these changes in behavior, but only that this appears like to be a worthwhile hypothesis in terms of examining the role that changes in behavior might play in speciation. So to conclude, a lot of the models that try to explain the high species richness of the tropics emphasize changes in the physical landscape. So there are figures there from two different papers where people have talked about, say, things such as the buildup of the Andes, fragmenting populations, creating the Amazon River system, generating massive allopathic divergence via vicariance, or things such as the origin of river systems in Amazonia, or the changes in climate of the Pleistocene leading to fragmentation of populations and these cycles which produce the origin of new species, et cetera. I don't want to say that these models don't apply. Of course, they're useful, and there's a lot of evidence for that. But I think what I showed you is that there are other ways in which you might get divergence in the tropics that imply making no assumptions about the role of historical changes in the landscape. even on a static landscape like we have today, where we have mountains separating populations, rivers separating populations, those mountains creating gradients in, say, precipitation, that things might breed at different moments in different places. And having the sort of geographic scenario where maybe a population that used to be formerly migratory can become a resident now, implying no changes in the physical environment, might lead to the origin of new species. So the point here is that I guess the origin of the high tropical diversity is multifaceted. There are a lot of things that are contributing to the high diversity that has fascinated naturalists for so long, and I hope to have shown you some evidence that looking at those patterns from the lens of phylogenetics and historical evolutionary biology might be a fruitful avenue to understand the origin of diversity. And with that, I'll thank people that have funded my work, particularly over recent years, and a bunch of different collaborators. And I was putting this together this morning, and I realized I'm starting to get kind of oldish. I used to have a single picture of my grad students, and now I have 5 different generations that are largely non-overlapping. So that means that I've been there for a long time now at Los Andes, and students at Universidad Los Andes have been great. One of them is a professor here now. And much of the work we do that is with the help of undergrads who do much of the work I showed you here today. And thank you very much for listening, and happy to take questions. Yes? Yeah, the first part of your question might be easier to try to answer. I think we're seeing a lot of evidence of these migratory dropouts where things that used to be migratory become sedentary. And I think, contrary to what I just said, it probably has to do a lot with changes in Earth history. So now it's like a warmish period. It's fine. I mean, conditions to sort of lose migration might be optimal. Whereas there might be other times in Earth history where conditions for the evolution of migration might be more frequent. But we're seeing a lot of contemporary examples of populations that used to be migratory and are becoming residents. So I guess it might be related to that. Why do some of them migrate and why some of them do not? It's a harder question to address. I don't know, and I'm not sure if sort of the scenario I painted where, so you have these migratory birds that come and go, and just a subset of them stayed, and the other ones kept coming and going. Maybe it didn't quite happen like that. Maybe you had some period of geographic isolation. Populations diverge enough that they diverge genetically, and that's why they don't come and go. I guess social factors are also important, like do birds learn they have to move? I don't know, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes?
So you mentioned 3 different modes of evolutionary divergence, and it's very clear how the allopatric deviation would be associated with mountains. What about the other 2 methods, allochronic and loss of migration? Wouldn't those be just as relevant for lowlands all over the world, or how much are those associated with mountains?
Sure, that's a good question. I think that the allochronic divergence mediated by climate is a lot more likely in mountains, because when you have topographic relief, it's more likely that over short distances you have different rainfall regimes. Say you have a mountain that on one side it traps all the moisture, and the other side has it's a rain shadow. So you would get divergence more easily than, say, in the Amazon, that it's all flat. And essentially the only factor promoting sort of large-scale asynchrony in rainfall would be the movement of clouds north and south the equator, that kind of thing. The loss of migration, yeah, I think it could happen anywhere. Actually, this example I showed you is not focused on the mountains. It's east of the mountains in the llanos of.
Thanks. What about to temperate? Do you think it's also contributing to temperate diversity, or mostly tropical?
Well, Actually, this asynchrony of seasons idea, I think it applies largely to tropical organisms, because in the temperate zones, things are a lot more synchronic. I don't know how many birds are breeding in Michigan right now, but I bet very few. Whereas if in the spring, essentially everything is going to be breeding. There's a lot, I mean, evolutionary ecological reasons why birds in the temperate zone have much more restricted breeding seasons than in the tropics. And in the temperate zone, typically birds breed following cues like, say, photoperiod, and that initiates changes in gonad development. Whereas in the tropics, different species might have different strategies. So some might cue in rainfall, others in the availability of fruit, insects, et cetera. So a lot of different strategies that might lead to asynchronous breeding in the tropics. And then the geography and climate leads to more heterogeneous climates at a given moment in time in the tropics than in the temperate zone. In terms of loss of migration, I'm not sure if you have a feeling, Ben. I don't know any birds from the temperate zone that stopped migrating to the tropics. Locally, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, so changes in, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, there. I mean, I can think of some short distance migrants like juncos, but.
Oh, right. Yeah, there's junco population in California that became settled in the UCSD campus and became resident, and it's diverging in a bunch of different ways. And if you come back in 100 years, it might be a different species. Yeah.
Yeah, I think things like bird feeders and agricultural modifications have changed some things, but I'm not sure if there's a more kind of organic record of something else. Yeah.
Right. Anything else? All right. Thanks very much.